Ali. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for waiting. We will now begin our program. I now call on Mr. Heflin Bai to give us the opening prayer.
Ali malungil tutaw, tolulu. Ububal Dios ang narayang dagi tero bermadam elal tutaw, mangular kau, mereng asule milkirela aklisi alam selar ngum milkirela arokul tokoy. Ruba kagi other city al workshop per imam, malol ngita ngil attention ngil al workshop per el al sils, el kirela pension plan. Ruba kau mitangil wasel al time rabelu rebela ya mal matarbas mam magi ti other saklangar kamam imam olangit terkau ruba la semong tigay kamam kamam bol sa aman madu lol ngasengs ol tirak kerkau agi meneng asule olangit tayga rokul ngarang klem kal jangan lo sebelam amen.
Thank you, Mr. Bai. Just one more announcement. The camera will be recording the first part of the workshop, which is the orientation portion. And then once we break out into the breakout groups, the cameras will stop recording. Yeah? So at this time, I call on Minister Caleb Udoy Jr. of the Ministry of Finance to give us the opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I was listening to Heflin's prayer. He was very relaxed. We've already done Social Security, so I think he's anticipating this workshop because he doesn't have much involvement other than to help the pension plan hopefully come up with a great solution I think we came up with for Social Security. And hopefully their hearing with the Congress was successful. And the Congress will, the Senate in particular, will take up the work and progress it. I think we've come up with a very good solution for Social Security, but I'm sure we can come up with an equally good solution for the Civil Service Pension Plan as well. So welcome everybody to this very important workshop. As I said, we did have a previous workshop for Social Security. So some of you have been in that workshop, and others are new to this exercise. We had hoped that the OEK members could join in. Unfortunately, they have a special session today. And in the afternoon, we also have a visiting delegation from Washington that is also expected to meet with them. So I think that they will be tied up in the afternoon as well. Hopefully they can join us tomorrow as they did with the Social Security workshop. They do provide valuable inputs, and I think the exercise is useful to them to understand the way of thinking that we are trying to get across during this workshop. So maybe to give perspective, especially to us in finance, the pension plan is an important part of Palau's retirement system, and I say overall Palau as a country. The system includes several parts. Social Security is the one that most of us are comfortable with because it affects everyone, both public and private sector. The Civil Service Pension Plan is a little bit more targeted towards government employees. Of course, we also do have government programs of assistance for various sectors, more vulnerable people in the economy, such as the Lifeline Subsidy Program, such as those for disabled, regular programs. There's also targeted systems like the COVID relief program that we implemented during the pandemic. People are responsible, I think. We should always look at taking responsibility for our own lives, and I think Palauans are like that. You take care of yourself, and then people are still there to help you, but you try not to be a burden on others. So people should be saving. I think when you're working, you should put a little bit aside for a rainy day or for your children or for other purposes. There's also private investments. I know that several companies here are participating in other retirement programs, especially from the private sector. If you remember, before we had national health insurance, many people were signing up for Calvo's health insurance. Then the government put forward its program, and then we have a government program that covers everybody, and then additional insurance if you're, or investment, health insurance, supplemental, like AFLAC. We can do the same thing for a retirement program. A lot of companies here are already having retirement programs from Guam, companies out of Guam. So I'm thinking that this is another opportunity for people to expand the plan for their retirement. And then, of course, there's our culture. You know, if you go to United States, for instance, where many of us go, we're often faced with those challenges of paying for your funeral expenses, your final expenses. And what do people do? They get insurance for that purpose. I think our culture provides for that. But you're starting to see more people during the funerals. We have that other issue to deal with, is private insurance. So I think this, I don't want to talk too long, but since I have the mic, our solution is happening at a difficult time for us. We are not doing well as a government. We're in a period of fiscal distress. The pandemic has lasted longer than we anticipated. Tourism has not come back, and we still are maintaining a high level of government expenditure. We need to make sure that we take care of those people who are most vulnerable in particular. So fuel prices have gone up. I'm not sure how many of you attended the symposium, but the picture is not very rosy. So this is a difficult time for us, but what choice do we have? The pension plan problem, the Social Security problem have been kicked down the road. Now we're at a time where we have to deal with it, and we're not in a very good place. So I think it's going to make us more challenging for us to fix this problem. And this position we're in is not going to be something that's fixed tomorrow. Yes, China Air has started to fly, but it's only a piece of the overall tourism that Palau enjoyed before. So I expect that it's going to be a problem for at least another 2 years. And this is about the time that the pension plan is going to exhaust its trust fund. And if nothing happens, people are going to be paying less than half of what they're getting now. This is why the WIPS administration is working very hard to find a solution out of this. I mean, we're doing things that are conventional, like trying to bring back tourism at a time when it's very difficult to increase tourists to come here. US dollars are very strong. We're using the US dollars, and all these other countries are experiencing higher inflation and a lower value of their money. So it's hard to ask them to come here. And then, of course, the higher fuel prices mean higher fares for the airlines, so they cannot afford to come to Palau. So, not to discourage you from today's exercise, but I wanted to put things in perspective so that we really think about a way to fix this problem that works for everyone in the long run. And I think we did that for Social Security, and we can do that again for the pension plan solution. So thank you all for coming together to help, and thanks to our partners who are helping us to find a solution. Those that you see on the screen behind me, in particular, the Asian Development Bank, who is helping to fund the expenses for us to get together, and the graduate school who is helping us coordinate, facilitate this workshop so that we can come to a solution without worrying about those other things. So thank you again. I know we do have media here. I keep finding myself looking this way, but I hope that you can be a part of this and share the information following the workshop, the process of how we got to a solution. If we do find a solution, which I'm not sure we will, if we do, and we should try, we need to share with other people how it worked and why we chose that way. A good example is the last workshop for Social Security. It was the younger people in the workshop that said, we don't care if you raise the rates to 9%. And I think everybody was shocked. But they see the importance of the system, and they want to make sure that we have a system for the long run. They're the ones who are paying for everybody else's retirement system. So I hope we can have some revelations like that in this, and I encourage all of us to participate as much as you can. We're all friends here. We don't need to have a difficult time working together to make something happen. So if you do have a position, you think of it strongly enough, please share and work together to find the right solution. Thank you.
So at this time, we'll have Mr. Kevin O'Keefe, Economic Advisor from the Graduate School USA, give us a presentation on the Civil Service Pension Plan reform.
Thank you, MC Thurong. And I'll get right into it. If you were here for the Social Security workshop, this will be very familiar to you. The exercise will be very familiar to you. If you weren't at the Social Security workshop, it'll probably feel like a very different exercise than what you've gone through in the past. One of the biggest differences is we as outside advisors are making no recommendations and not even trying to answer questions in ways that would prefer one outcome over another outcome. This Social Security and civil service pension plans are deeply macroeconomically important. Social Security, especially at the household level, but similarly civil service pension plan. Every pension recipient is sharing that check with somebody else, and maybe many people in the family. So this is not something that outside advisors can give you a technical answer for, because ultimately, as the minister mentioned, we're looking for people to kind of stand up and not just represent their stakeholder interests, but also think about the whole community of Palau. And sometimes that means there's some shared sacrifice. And before we get started, I can say that some shared sacrifice is in your future. If you do nothing, it's in your future. But the system will tell you what the sacrifice will be. If you do reforms, you can pick and choose and mix and match and try to balance out the share of sacrifice across lots of different stakeholder groups. So my role is really just to kind of explain the situation you're in, not to throw any blame, and I hope others can feel the same way. It is true that the problem has been known for a long time, and solutions have been considered for a long time. But it's also true that those were hard decisions back then, and they're hard decisions now. It's just that the urgency is coming closer because of the likely failure of the trust fund. It's getting smaller and smaller and cannot withstand the weight of the system as designed. So with that, let me get started. Just briefly what I'm going to cover. We're going to talk about the current system as is and what is likely to happen to it. We're going to talk about some possible reforms and what some assumptions that have already been made. Then we're going to try to model what those reforms might look like, but we're not going to do all of the modeling here. When we break up into groups, you'll be the ones that are working through your chairman, working through the assistants, the technical assistants to the chairman, to just try all the different variables. We're going to name 7 variables. And if you recall, during the Social Security workshop, we were blessed. There were 7 variables. Group A, we chose 3 from that group. Group B, we chose 3 variables from that group. And the 7th variable, they had already agreed. So from the perspective and the outcome, it felt like the results were very well owned by the groups that had worked so hard balancing the various factors that were important to them. And we hope that something similar may happen. We also have 7 variables this time. And then finally, we'll just go through a further elaboration of how the workshop works. So current policy. The Asian Development Bank is supporting our team's work in this exercise, and they're also supporting an actuarial firm out of England that is kind of feeding their analytical work into our analytical work. So they have all the analysis, actuarial analysis of the system, and then we put it into the model so that you can really easily utilize it. We try to make it as user-friendly as possible. Just briefly, why do we have a problem? In FY22, contributions are approximately 7.8 million, and benefits to be paid, or benefits paid in FY22, exceeded that by 6.1 million. Now, part of that was supported by appropriations. Part of that was expected to be supported by investment returns, but of course it was a negative year for all markets. And so the reserve fund fell by a substantial portion. By the end of 22, it was 20.6 million. In FY23, there was a supplemental appropriation of 1.2 million. So you start out the year with, I guess, 21.8 as the balance of the fund. Looking forward just a few years, contributions are going up with change in the payroll, but so too, and even faster, benefits are going up. This is not because the benefits are, that much more. It's because many more people are retiring. These are people that have been in the system for 30, 35 years, and just naturally, it so happens that there are fewer people entering the workforce and more people leaving the workforce. You might call it a bubble of senior workers. And even if senior workers leave, they're replaced by younger workers at lower wages. So we have this double problem that there were that many people in the system that are now going to come into benefit mode, having relied upon the system, and therefore we need to figure out a way to deal with that. By the beginning or end or around FY27, FY28, the fund will be fully tapped. There will be no more fund to support, to make up the gap between contributions from current workers and benefits being received by existing beneficiaries. By the way, can I just take a poll? Could you stand up if you're an existing beneficiary in the civil service pension plan? Or raise your hand. Raise your hand. Okay. So representing one group of stakeholders. Raise your hand if you're a government employee paying into the civil service pension plan. Almost the rest of the group. Most of the rest of the group, okay? So everybody here has a particular interest in a good solution, no doubt. Now, what does that look like if we show it on a chart? First of all, the green line is the benefit stream. The blue line is contributions. And by the way, contributions just steadily grow, right? Because the government's going to keep going. It's going to keep giving pay raises to its workers. Occasionally there will be an extraordinary pay raise, but otherwise they'll get step increases and promotions as they go through their careers. So no surprise that that blue line is very stable. The red line is the fund, starting at 21.8 million and being called upon year after year after year to fill a gap. It's gone in 4 or 5 years. Now, at the time that it's gone, we're painting a really gruesome picture here. We're saying that when that fund is gone, only the existing contributions will be available every month to pay the benefits every month. And that reduction, that fall, basically results in getting less than 50 cents on the dollar and going down to about 42 cents on the dollar. And on the next page, we show what that means. If your pension is $1,000 a month, it would go to $840. If your pension is $750 a month, it would go to $315. Essentially reducing by more than half if there's no other solutions in place. Now, there's lots of things that can be done, fortunately, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to try to find a solution where the outcome is way better than the do-nothing, zero reform option. Now, some of you might just let the legislature make up the gap every year. They're used to giving up to 3 or 4 million, sometimes 1 million, sometimes 2 million. But here we're talking about 10, 12, 14 million if they were to make up the full gap. So that ends up being probably, if you took that and the debt that Palau has, there'd be virtually nothing left from the general fund. Clearly, taxes would have to be raised. Now, we're going to use tax raise as one of the variables for you all to consider. We're going to use the payroll tax that the employers currently contribute as one of the variables. But the point is that if nothing is done, no solutions are put in place, the administrators of the system, all they'll be able to do is collect biweekly contributions and issue monthly checks. And I would imagine, given the timing issues, they might even fall a little bit short. If you look at that green line, the benefit line, it's a little bit below the blue line because there's also operational costs. So they have to pay to administer the system, so they can't give out every penny if they're not subsidized. They would have to withhold a little bit from the beneficiaries. So this process, just like the Social Security reform, we worked with a steering committee, again, with no preconceived solutions, but just working as technicians and working with the actuarial consultants to know what the government would want to put forward as possible reforms. Now, in this case, the reform committee has looked at a series of prior actuarial reports and a series of recommendations. They've looked at the projections for unfunded liabilities just continuing to grow far into the future. Now, it just so happens that on the balance sheet of the government of Palau, the unfunded liabilities of the Social Security system are not booked. Who knows why? According to accounting practices, the civil service pension plan liability is booked as a liability of the government. And so that means that the liability of the government continues to grow in the civil service pension plan. They've looked at defined contribution plans, which I'm going to talk about just a little bit. We're not going to explain a lot, but A defined pension plan, a defined benefit plan, which is the CSPP, everybody contributes throughout their whole career. In the case of Palau, 6% from the employee and 6% from the employer go into a fund. And everybody is promised a benefit when they retire that's based on a couple of factors. The number of years of service that they have credit for, and the percentage crediting rate that the system uses. So for example, you work for 20 years, you get a 2% per year credit. When you finally retire, you get 40%, 2% times 20, you get 40% of your final salary. Final salary is calculated as the high 3, the average of the average of the highest 3 years. So in effect, the system is building up a balance and then paying out at a later date. And you may ask, how come this system isn't working? Is 6% plus 6% not enough? Actually, it's close to enough. Is the 2% crediting rate too high? Yeah, it's probably a little bit too high compared to the money that's been brought in. Are the benefits to subsequent beneficiaries when a benefit member passes away, their dependents, a little bit too generous? Yeah, a little bit. But if we take the fact that the crediting rate is a little bit too high for the system, and maybe the beneficiary benefits are a little bit generous, those are small factors. The biggest factor, and apologies to any ministers or people in the room, is sort of the original sin of the system. The system was never funded at the beginning. And so the current workers who were near the end of their career might have stayed in the system for 2 or 3 years, but they'd been with the government for 20 or 30 years. They got the crediting rate, they got the 20 to 30 years, and they took money out of the current employees' contributions. So you're not, current employees are not really paying for themselves. They're paying for that gap that's been with the system the entire time. This is why we don't want to throw blame. We just want to go fix the system that is not able to sustain on current conditions. So they've looked at other plans. Defined benefit plans tend to have this problem. All the employees planning for pension are relying on government to fulfill its promises, to maintain fiscal strength, and to prioritize them over school children and hospital. But in a defined contribution plan, which I'm going to describe in very little detail, defined contribution plan, the employee puts in a certain amount, and the employer matches a certain amount. It goes into an account in the individual name of that employee, in a trust fund, not on the books of the government, not within the access of the government. That's basically your money growing subject to market returns. Now those market returns will be volatile, but on average they'll be substantial, so that you can expect that not only will your contributions be there, but some accrued earnings on top, especially the longer you're in the system, the better. Now that system creates no liability for the government, which is another way of saying employees have no reliance on the government for their retirement security. Once the contributions are made by the government, they're matched up with theirs. Now, will there be rules? Do you have to stay in government for 5 years to get full access? Yeah, there will be some rules like that. But if you stay longer than 5 years, that money is fully vested in an individual account in the name of the employee. Now, guess what? we can say that defined contribution system has lots of benefits, but switching from defined benefit to defined contribution creates a big headache. Why? Imagine if we go back to the system and we say all of the contributions are no longer going to go to the pension plan, they're going to go into individual accounts. As if we could walk away from the obligations to retirees and future retirees. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to find a solution that's achievable, that's sustainable, that's financeable, that shifts to a defined contribution plan. But terminates the pension plan. I want to let that soak in a little bit, because this is not a variable in the workshop that we have today. This is what the administration and the steering committee have decided in advance. If we have this problem, it's been growing over time, if we're in a hole, let's stop digging. Let's not make things worse every year as we go along. Let's terminate the pension plan for all existing workers and immediately shift them into a contribution plan. And then let's figure out how to take care of the obligations. So imagine we have a retired pension plan or a frozen pension plan. Now we got to take care of all those obligations. And introduce, at some point in the future, determined by the willingness to undertake reform and the best timing. In the modeling that we do, we say it starts 11 months from now at the beginning of FY24. But the modeling will not change that much if you wait another 6 months or 12 months. What's important is stopping the growth of the liabilities, switching employees to a system that they can count upon for their own individual accounts, and then finding a way to fund and finance as much of the obligations of the pension plan as possible. There's no magic. We're going to show you. First of all, the assumptions. We're assuming that the $21.8 million fund will be already smaller at the end of 23 and smaller again at the end of 24. But that any investment returns it earns will probably be from safer investments because it has a very short lifespan and will be fully dedicated to the pension. All new employee contributions will go to a new DC, defined contribution plan. That's the break between the frozen plan and the new plan. At least half of the employer contributions. So imagine if we stick with the current numbers, employees keep putting 6% in. The employer would either put in 6 or less than 6, depending, it's going to be a variable that you all consider. You might divert some of the employer contribution, 1 or 2 or 3%, to take care of the pension obligation. So we're kind of splitting, as long as that's needed, it would go to taking care of the frozen pension plan. And maybe in the future, sadly pretty far in the future, it might revert to being a contribution to existing employees. And then lastly, you can't do this out of current resources readily. The nature of the problem, trying to find a solution, is that it's really high at the beginning and growing because of new retirees coming into the system, even when the system is frozen, they'll still be retiring with a pension benefit. And if they only work for 5 years, they'll have a small defined contribution account, but they'll have a larger pension that they expect to receive, or that we have to calculate for them to receive. So the two systems will be operating in parallel for decades. And we say in order to smooth that out, we're going to have to find some financing source that lets the system borrow enough money to meet the needs each year that are not being met once the fund is empty. And for the purposes of the model, there's kind of a threshold. We're saying that the maximum amount of borrowing at any given time is 25 million. Whether that's from a concessional partner or from some domestic resources that are already in Palau. This would be loans that paid an interest rate wherever they were borrowed from. If it was commercial, it would be a higher interest rate. If it was a development partner, it might be a lower interest rate. If it was Palau's own funds, it would still have to pay a competitive interest rate. So those are the assumptions. Now we look at the 7 variables. And these are the 7 variables that when you break up into Group A or you break up into Group B, working with your chair, working with the technical staff, those are the ones that you're going to be manipulating. You're going to be choosing among different options. One of the really powerful ones is to delay retirement from 60 to 65. That doesn't mean that someone that's 60 would have to wait to 65. It would be brought in over a period of 5 years. But somebody that's 55 would have to wait until 65 to get full retirement. But they would get a lesser amount if they retired at 64 or 63. It's not that the pension goes away. If they need to retire, if there's reasons why they need to retire, they'll still get a benefit, slightly reduced by retiring before the full retirement age. Now the choices there is keep it at 60 or pick any number above that up to 65. The second variable is unvested employees. These are employees that even in the current civil service pension plan, if they were to leave the government, would really have no call. They haven't been in the government long enough. And there we provide 3 options, which is to leave them in the system for the next 60 years, and they get a really tiny pension based on their salary, because it's going to stop, it's going to get frozen. Pay them nothing because that's what the system says, or pay them all of their contributions and put it into the defined contribution plan right at the beginning. So that just happens to be 3 options. For those between 5 and 15 years, in the current system, they're allowed to take money out if they leave the government, a lump sum, and they can even put it back in if they come back to the government. But we only have 2 options. One is to leave them in the system and they'll get a retirement check when they retire, a pension, together with their presumably bigger defined contribution plan. They still have quite a long time until retirement. So they'd really have a hybrid. They'd have a pension that they've already earned and they know what it's going to be, and then they'd have the defined contribution, including their own contributions and a match from the government. Variable 4 is a pretty powerful one. It's reducing that 2% crediting rate, and I think we've provided options from 2%, 1.75, 1.5, or 1.25. 1.25 is even higher than the US federal crediting rate of 1.1%. 1.5 is about what state teachers unions usually use for their pension in the United States. I don't think I've found a system other than maybe the police force in a few places where the crediting rate is as high as 2%, because they tend to force retirement early from police and fire. So there will be 4 choices there. Now you can imagine if you leave it at 2%, there's no savings. But if you move it down, there will be savings. And who will be sacrificing if there are savings? Anybody want to? Who will be sacrificing if we change the crediting rate from 2% downward? Anybody who retires after the reform or after the 5-year transition rules of the reform, right? So there's some sacrifice there. Pension beneficiary reduction. So if you're an existing beneficiary, there are, I think, 4 options again. Making a 0% deduction. And this is where I think every group is going to start. You know, God bless them, they've already retired. They can't change their plans. They can't undo decisions that they made. And they're relying upon a certain amount. But we have options of a 2.5% cut, a 5% cut, a 7.5% cut, or a 10% cut. Again, this is for the groups to kind of mix and match. If the sharing is going to be, for example, tilted towards those people that have more time to react, then the burden on the current beneficiaries would be either 0 or low. If it was tilted towards the size of the pension check, then the existing pensioners would take a bigger cut, and the future pensioners with a frozen plan would take a smaller cut. But again, it's not for us. We're just presenting a model that allows you all working together to put it together to reach a potential solution. So the first 5 are affecting the current workforce or the current pensioners, the current pension beneficiaries. The last 2 relate to outside the system. Variable 6, government payroll contribution, we're saying 0 to 3% could be dedicated to the frozen pension to help solve the problem. We're not saying up to 6%, we're saying half of the current 6% that the government's already used to budgeting for. But do they give it to the new plan, or do they divert 1, 2, or 3% to the old obligations? Old but very real obligations. And that, again, it's a variable for you to choose. And when you run this, people that are running the model, they're already familiar with it. So they can help you see how much effect does this one variable have? How much effect do these 2 variables together have? So there will be some just experimenting, but hopefully you'll first set what you think are your principles and your priorities. And then finally, we're about to have a value-added tax, the Palau goods and services tax. We're 6 weeks away from it being a reality. We're 2.5 months away from the first filings, February, when the businesses will be filing their returns, but consumers will see a value-added tax starting January 1st. And this is saying, okay, on top of that 10%, how much of this problem solving do we want to put on the entire economy? Right? Different stakeholder groups. If it's adding to the Palau goods and services tax, everybody faces it, but it's shared very widely. If it's changing the crediting rate, it's the people that are retiring in the future that will take that sacrifice. And if there's enough reforms across, we're going to ask you to consider, okay, how well balanced is this? How much of it is the workers? How much is the government? How much of it is the economy as a whole? Remember, the businesses are a pass-through. The businesses are not paying the value-added tax. The consumers are. It's a tax on point of final sale of consumption of goods and services. So it's the broadest tax possible. That's the advantage of that tax. That's why it's been recommended. That's why it's eventually been adopted. And it creates the possibility, if you have a really strong priority that's important for the whole economy, but in this case it's the civil service pension plan, you can go and get a portion of the solution to that problem and know that it's the entire economy, the entire set of consumers that are contributing to the solution. Now, can you be too strong? We're saying 0 to 2.5%. That's, again, for you all to consider in your groups. But the stakeholder is not business, the stakeholder is not government, the stakeholder is everybody who spends money in the economy, including, fortunately, tourists. So to the extent possible, and what's new about this tax is that it does a better job of making sure that benefits come to the government through the tax channel from tourists. A little bit of the problem is solved from a recovered, I'm looking at the minister, from a recovered tourism industry. At the moment, it would not be, coming very much from tourists. Any questions on the variables? On top of the 10. Any other questions on the variables? So when you're looking at the model, you're going to see two charts. One of them will look like this. This is the entire obligation of the pension system if it's frozen at the beginning of FY24. All those amounts rising from close to 12 million up to 14 million, all those amounts need to be financed or funded in order for the pensions to be fully supported. Now, if we reduce the pensions by changing the crediting rate, that gray area will come down a little bit. If we reduce the pensions by moving from 60 to 65, that gray area will get pushed to the right and come down a little bit. If we add taxes or if we allocate some of the payroll contribution to the system, it won't change the gray area, but it will add, and I'll show you that in a second. The second and more important chart that you're going to look at looks like this. And here we just run the model. We pretend there's a banker waiting outside government office. Every time they need to give money to the civil service pension plan, they just add to the loan. But obviously with their zero reform model, to cover the entire obligation with no reforms, cost over the time 900 million. And by the way, even when it's 900 million, there's no financing source to pay the 4% interest on the 900 million. It just keeps exploding. So how much would it cost to run the program and borrow every year to pay? With a 4% interest rate, it would cost 900 million over the next, through FY60. And yet you wouldn't be done. You'd have a $900 million debt. So that's with zero reform. Now we can actually solve this with that debt never going above 25 million. But I'm not going to do that for you. You're going to do the hard work to get there in Group A and in Group B. But I am going to show you one example that solves about half of the problem. And again, I'm not trying to pick variables over other variables. But if we go to age 65, and if we change the crediting rate from 2% to 1.75, and we take an extra 1% economy-wide from consumers and apply it to the problem. See, the green line is the tax, and you see that it, for a long time, all the way out until FY53 or so, it's not enough. There's still a gap. You finally hit a crossover point around FY54, where those three changes, and again, you've got many, many dozens of possible changes with 7 variables and 3 or 4 choices per variable. There's a wide variety of changes that you can consider. This one still leads to kind of an unending borrowing path up to about 350 million. Again, more than the size of the economy as a whole, more than any lender standing by would ever be willing to undertake. But this is just a measure. If we go back to the solutions, sorry, I can tell you that this solved about half of the obligation. When we start out, you're going to have a model that your technician and chair will have access to, and they'll show it on the screen, just like I'm showing it now. On the left-hand side, all 7 variables. Each of them has choices. You have 3 choices for the 0 to 5 years, 2 choices for the 5 to 15 years, and so on. Every time you make a change, you'll see the charts on the right change. And as we've just changed 3, we know that only reduced the liabilities by a little over half. Now, what are the liabilities of the system? We start out with, if we freeze the pension, no more pension, but obligations still with us, we have a $206 million problem to solve. That's how much it would take if we had money in the bank already and we could just pay the system. We'd need 206 million. If we borrow it as we go along, we got to pay interest, and it's even more than that. But really, ultimately, that's the size of the problem you're trying to solve. And with the variables, again, the technicians and your chairs are going to help you first start with principles and how you want the solution to look in terms of balance and fairness and equity. And then you're going to start using the model to try to come up with a solution. And the solution, I can assure you, will be not just moving 1 variable or 2, it will be moving several variables to a certain extent. And the goal is to turn these red boxes into green boxes with a green check. If you put in the right variables, that's what will happen. Automatically when the chairman takes a recommendation from a group member of Group A, then the technician will put in that and then hit, like the model, run it, and you'll see whether it's enough or still not enough. Now you can see how much progress you're making by looking at how much savings you're making. Ultimately, you have to make savings that add up to not quite 206 million, because you got a 20 million balance at the beginning. You've got the trust fund at the beginning. So really the size of the problem is 206 minus 20 that you're getting a head start with the fund. The fund is not going to the defined contribution new plan. The fund is staying with the frozen pension plan. And when you keep going, you'll eventually get to the point where, okay, we're almost there, what else can we do? If what else you do seems really unfair to one group or one set of stakeholders, then you might want to go back to 0 and start again. It's up to the way the dialogue and the way the groups find solutions. So how are we going to do this? If you were here before, there will be Group A. Now, Group A, these are none of us outsiders, right? We're not in those groups. We might get called in to answer a question, a technical question, or There might be a glitch with the model or something like that, but this is for, and we assume that it's just going to be people speaking in whatever language they're most comfortable, expressing their views as strongly as they want to express their views, but ultimately trying to get to a final solution. So I've already said all these things. None of the outsiders will be engaging. The technicians will have a copy of this presentation, so you have a question and you want to go back to something that was in the presentation, they'll be able to show that. But mostly they're going to be showing the model. And the chairs have these guidelines with them. Before you jump to mathematical solutions, we want you to have stated principles. Sort of, what are the most important things in considering this? Now, I can hazard to guess that one really important thing is to not leave the system high and dry. You might be willing to accept that a new system is being proposed, but surely there's got to be a desire to protect the system that people have been counting on for all this time. Then you're going to get to going through all the variables, and ultimately you're going to try to solve the problem. Now, to be clear, the problem is solved when there's no more liabilities at the end of the period, and the debt that was used to get through that solution never exceeded 25 million. Now, if we had put that threshold at 900 million, you'd be done. But we don't have any bank, any source of financing, anywhere to go to provide 900 million of financing. So we had to come up with a reasonable level that might be available from concessional or domestic sources. And the model is smart enough to give you a green check when you get there. Now at the end, if you look at it, the model will have those a situation where those reforms are no longer needed. That 2% extra tax could eventually go away or be given to some other source. The 1 or 2 or 3% that you may take from the employer contribution, if it's dedicated to the pension, could also come off probably earlier. So some of these reforms are not permanent. They're a source of funding when the funding is no longer needed. And the way the model works is the funding is no longer needed when the balance of the fund is large enough to pay all of the outstanding obligations going forward. Now, these obligations carry forward for a really long time. Our pensioners, Haru is going to live to 140. So there we go. We got to keep writing checks. But people that retire 20 years from now are also going to start with a partly defined contribution that they already have, but also the obligations under this system. So the system will still be writing checks for a long time. But at some point, the fund will be large enough to cover that, and the notion of having to keep all the reforms in place will stop far in the future. And that's it. And then step 3, the package of reforms is agreed upon in Group A and Group B, and then the chairs or their designees will come and present it. And if we're really lucky, Group A and Group B will be almost the same results, or if they're substantially different, we'll find a way to reconcile those differences within the principles that each group has shown, so that we can basically say, the end of the workshop, this group of people that have worked hard, consider all the alternatives, thought about the best way to have a new system, protect the old system, can say with some strength, maybe even testify to the OEK, this is a pretty good result. And it's a lot better than the do nothing, which gives us 42 cents on the dollar, or a debt that we cannot even remotely take care of. So let me stop there. That's the end of the presentation. Group A and Group B have to kind of, are they divided already from the sign-in list? Yeah. Thank you, Lyndon. So you'll know from the desk whether you're going to stay here in Group A or go upstairs in Group B. But first, any questions before you break out? Question. Please.
Okay. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And obviously, this is a very serious issue we agree we have to address, and making difficult decisions. In your presentation, you're making it very clear. We obviously understand what PGST stands for, which is, a recessive tax that's going to affect all consumers. And you talk about, what may help that is to add on those 1% over, above, and every tax that's going to be added to it. So would you suggest, because it sounds to me that, Palau, cost of living is very high, affordable of living is difficult. So would it be partial to say that we have to also question the need to increase minimum wage, because it has to be that buying power for even the consumers? Because every time you're adding more tax, then you're taking away that buying power for the consumers, which may also affect another question in impacting what class of people are we affecting because of this increase. I mean, is there going to be are people going to feel it because if we remain the same status quo of our income, or do we need to also work with that so people don't feel the impact and minimum wage is higher, including private sectors? What do we do to help them so they're not as impacted as well?
So let me take that as two excellent questions. Firstly, we need to compare the additional proposed, if the groups propose an additional tax as part of the solution, we need to compare the stakeholders that affects with the stakeholders affected by reducing the checks down to 42 cents on the dollar for the pensioners. Right? Because we cannot just compare it to, well, we don't have to raise the tax, because if we don't raise the tax, then that small group, pensioners and people retiring in the near future, will be cut at an amazing amount. Not an incremental amount, but a really substantial amount. So that's the comparison. We cannot forget that we're trying to solve a problem that, if not solved, will fall on a very narrow base. Okay? And that's why sometimes using something like a PGST, which has a wide base, can contribute to equity. Now, the second part about the PGST, yes, it's a regressive tax. It's more powerful on low incomes who spend more of their money consuming food and housing and things like that, necessities, than wealthier folks who tend to have some savings and also may consume some things outside of the country. So, but that's been very well addressed through the package of reforms by introducing a big change to the wages and salaries tax, by essentially eliminating the wages and salaries tax on everybody that earns less than $15,000. So that deals not fully, but quite effectively with the notion of regressive consumption tax, PGST. And then secondly, the net profits tax is exactly designed to have the businesses contribute to the tax base in a way that they feel they were contributing, but they've really never been contributing. The GRT has always been something like a sales tax or a consumption tax with some real big problems like cascading at different levels of sale. But it's always been something that businesses have the ability to effectively pass on to the final user. Maybe not 100%, but the incidence of that tax is, when we do the math, I'm going to be a nerd now, is very highly on the final consumer and very little on the business. But it hurt the business in some ways because they had to pay even when they were in a growth mode, right? So there were a lot of big flaws with that GRT tax that only took 70 years to replace. from TT days. But the one advantage it had was it was easy to collect and easy to understand. And so it stayed for a long time. But I think the addition here, again, going back to your first question, you want to balance it across the different stakeholders. But remember that the no reform option is so narrowly targeted on existing pensioners and people that are going to retire in the near future, with very little time to change their plans or react. Other questions? Question.
Thank you for going through all the variables. I'm wondering, can you give us a picture of the payout? My very shallow understanding is that there are the retirees, there are the beneficiaries who were appointed, and some of them are their children, and some are actually grandchildren. So they have a longer time where they're withdrawing from the plan. And at the same time, there's no age limit of when can you stop, when do you stop receiving. So if you were a child of the government employee or their grandkids, you have a lot of years to be getting money, which. So can you give us a picture of the problem we're trying to resolve by explaining all the variables? And if those categories of, if there are people who designated their children or grandchildren, can they be moved to a different source of revenue stream, whether it be a tax payable by the community as a whole like they do in Australia, or can we use the PGST to address those? And so the funding that we are, the government employees are currently contributing will only goes to the actual people who serve in government. Thank you.
So, good question. If we compare this exercise to the Social Security workshop, it's similar. We provided 7 high-level variables that are very powerful. But we do also have, we do note that there are some unusual ways in which beneficiaries take their benefits. And we would, but they're not going to be large in impact in terms of the overall system. And so there might be some recommended changes that the steering group makes or that the OEK puts in through its own initiative that might change that a little bit. But most pensions have survivor benefits, and so we expect there to be survivor benefits. It's just a question of whether they're done in a way that makes sense, across the board. And as far as the variables, you've got a pretty good choice of the most powerful variables. Another question, Irene.
It's not really a question, Kevin. Thank you so much. I see that it is an excellent time to integrate the private sector and into partnership with the public sector on a retirement plan for the nation of Palau. And so I'm looking forward to us working toward solutions. And I'm wondering, is it okay to share your presentation via email so we can kind of look at it on our laptops when we're working with the groups?
Sure. So we'll send it to your technicians and rapporteurs and chairs, and you can get it from them. Although, Irene, I can send it to you as well. So one thing that Irene mentioned, being a representative of the private sector, there is an assumption that when the defined contribution plan is in place and operating effectively, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, however long it takes, the private sector will be invited to join in and take advantage of that program if the employers want to offer that for their employees. Okay? The plan will have certain rules, but eventually it will be an economy-wide plan. Now, you can't do that with a pension because you'd be taking on obligations that you can't afford. But remember, the government is just an agent. They're just passing the payroll and the payroll contributions on to the trust, and the trust company is holding it in trust for all the individual employees. So that makes it possible to expand it to a broader base, to increase savings, and to increase retirement security, not just for the public sector, but for the private sector. Chairman, Minister.
So currently, if I'm not mistaken, the PPEF has a percentage that goes into the pension. Assuming that we tweak with the PGST, will that be removed, or are they getting both benefits?
Well, maybe the group should comment on that, but hopefully it would stay with the obligation. Every little bit helps. And when the tourists are back, it's not a little bit, it's a little bit more. Yeah. Let's take a break to refreshments, and you'll be able to see which group you're in. Lyndon, is Group B upstairs? Oh, okay. Why don't you put it on the screen?